don't think anything I talk about can top this. But here's an example. Wait, I brought a little laser pointer today. Boom, look at that. Don't have to pace across here all the time. Here's a house built in Europe in the 1600s. There was high taxes on the towns on both sides of the river. It's like over there's a town, a lot of taxes. Over here's a town, a lot of taxes. There were no taxes on the river itself. It was not like a part of either town. So whoever built this house literally built it on a bridge over the river. When we talk about incentives mattering and incentives like affecting people's actions, literally built a house over water to avoid taxes.
How do people get across the bridge?
I think they built that bridge for the house. Unless they own the bridge and then, well, there's something in the house here. Okay. So we talked about price controls before we went off talking about prohibition and black markets. One of the main reasons I want to talk about black markets is because in this class I talk a lot about how markets are awesome and they lead you to like the best outcomes. And they encourage firms to meet consumer needs. And one of the things that's essential for a market to operate is government protection of private property rights and establishing a good legal system so that there's an arbitration process to handle disputes. They enforce contracts. It keeps the whole system functioning smoothly. When we remove that, people's self-interest, producers' self-interest in the black market drug dealers, their self-interest does not align with making consumers better off. And when we get this break in incentives, we don't have the same gains that we have in a functioning market. When producers are made better off by meeting consumer needs, when they're rewarded for that the most, then they're going to meet consumer needs. And it's going to be a great situation for people. It'll leave society better off. But when that's not the case, when you're not made best off by taking care of your consumers, by meeting their needs, then we're going to have this breakdown. It'll leave us in a suboptimal world. All right, so now to summarize this whole section, the effect of government price controls. So in a competitive market equilibrium, we've maximized both consumer and producer surplus. We can't make society any better off, but we can make individuals better off. So when government imposes, say, price controls that move us out of equilibrium, some people are made better off. So these are those winners that get the protection. The farmers that get the price floors for their wheat, the renters that get rent control, and the people on minimum wage that get their wages increased and keep their job. Some people are made worse off. So the firms that have higher labor costs, or the people that are unable to get a job at the new higher minimum wage. Everyone who has to buy wheat and the agricultural products from farmers and now higher prices. And for rent control, the landlords and the people who are unable to get houses at the new lower price because of the shortage. So there are some winners and some losers. In general, the economy is going to suffer because we're going to have deadweight loss from the transactions that don't take place. So we end up with a smaller pie to split up because of this deadweight loss. Now, just because there's less efficiency doesn't mean I'm standing up here making an argument that we should never do these things. My normal judgment is we should do these like very rarely. You can make the argument that we should still continue to do them because the benefits we gain of like equity or fairness or what have you outweigh the deadweight loss of society and are worth it for reducing the consumer-producer surplus. So this was the positive analysis that we've gone through. You can do your normative analysis and make these judgment calls for yourself. But it's important when you're considering this, when you're talking about different policies, weighing what you support, to know the costs and benefits of them. So now I want to look at an instance in US history where we had price controls, and far more extensive price controls than just little forays into price setting in like small markets or small areas. In the 1970s, we had runaway inflation. If you talk to your parents or your grandparents, they may bitch about the 70s, about like gas lines, about double-digit inflation. It was caused both by the Federal Reserve monetizing the debt, so increasing the money supply, and OPEC for the first time, reducing the output of oil, or driving up the price of goods. Because of this, in response, Richard Nixon introduced price controls, and he had C. Jackson Grayson, an economist, serve as the chairman of the Price Commission. So it's his job to set prices across all these different industries. He wrote a book about his experience and about how difficult it was and the things he had to do and decisions he had to make. And he came away with like 6 big lessons. So the first is that price controls mask real changes in economic fundamentals. So these price controls are implemented in order to fight inflation, but it assumes that all these price changes, the price increases, are due to inflationary pressures. It's not due to other things going on. Like as we know, changes in supply and demand are like constantly going on. And they're moving the new equilibrium price and quantity that will be sold on the market. So prices display and they communicate this information, and price controls prevent that from happening. So we don't know if a resource becomes more scarce and we should conserve it, or we don't know if something else is going on. Next, the role of profit is ignored. So implicit in price controls is this assumption that profit is a result of like taking advantage of consumers, that it's firms doing this at the expense of consumers. We also know that it serves as a signal and incentive, so it encourages firms that are meeting consumer needs, that are earning a profit on a product, to continue producing that product. It encourages other firms to enter that market. And then loss encourages firms, to stop making that product that isn't meeting consumer needs, move it to something else that does it better. So it removes this signal and this incentive from the market. So it makes it more difficult for firms to actually meet consumer needs. And also, by reducing the revenue that firms can earn, by holding down the prices, it helps or it discourages long-run investment. So it ends up keeping prices high in the long run, because firms have less money on hand to be able to get new equipment that increases their productivity, that can help lower costs. Next, it replaces economic competition with political competition. So price controls are going to change how resources are allocated, because it's changing the relative prices or not allowing prices to change between goods. But resources are still scarce. So there's going to be some form of competition for firms to be able to get the resources they need. So what happens is they end up lobbying government for more price controls on different industries, or to raise or lower different prices that the government's setting, instead of focusing on changing products or new ideas for products, more productive ways to make products. They end up focusing their efforts on lobbying the government. So it doesn't make consumers better off. They're not finding new ways to meet consumer needs. Next is price control's normalized attitude of reliance on government. So entrepreneurial efforts, kind of like the last point, they're focused not on creating new things. They're not focused on the consumer. They're focused on efforts lobbying government. So you go down to K Street in Washington, D.C., you have all these high-priced lobbyists working there. Firms are hiring a bunch of them to lobby on their behalf to protect their industry, instead of trying to find ways to meet consumer needs. So again, another instance where we have these incentives that aren't encouraging firms to make consumers better. So we have a breakdown in those aligned incentives. The next, price controls generate regime uncertainty. The idea of regime uncertainty is you don't know what the future regulatory policy is going to be. When you have C. Jackson Grayson sitting there trying to decide when he's going to change prices, it makes it more difficult to plan for the future, because you don't know when these are going to randomly change. So it makes it, again, more difficult, more risky to do long-run investment. So firms begin focusing more on the short term. And finally, price controls mask the true causes of economic problems. So they're framed as a response to a market failure. There's speculation going on in the market. There's greed. Firms trying to take advantage of consumers. And that's the underlying causes of what's actually causing these prices to increase. So it could be something with monetary policy. The Fed is, and we're going to talk about the Federal Reserve later in the class, they're increasing the money supply too much. So that's driving up inflation, and that's why things cost more. Maybe there's tariffs. There's a new tariff placed, so there's a tax on foreign goods, so it drives up the price of goods. Maybe there's new regulatory policy that makes the cost of production more expensive, and that's driving the cost. Maybe it's changes in the relative scarcities of these goods. One of the causes of inflation in the 70s was the increased cost of oil. So it's increasing production costs for like everything. When you have price controls and you prevent these prices from changing, from rising, you don't know what's going on. You don't know what the cause is. It's not able to communicate this information to market participants. And what it basically ends up doing is going after trying to mask the symptoms instead of focusing on the cause. So instead of, why are prices rising? Is it the monetary policy? Is it new regulations? Is it changes in relative scarcity? Instead of trying to figure that out, trying to figure a way around it to lower costs, what we end up doing is just trying to mask the symptoms of it. Okay. Now your textbook asks the question, why is Uber such a valuable company? It is kind of funny that because it's several years old, they have to explain what Uber is in case people don't understand it, but now we all know and use Uber. So what taxi medallions do is artificially restrict supply. So in like a lot of, especially big cities, they restrict the number of taxis that they have on the streets, and you have to buy a permit from the government.
One story really quick. I got stranded at Walmart last week because I took an Uber and he kept telling me I'm so lucky I got an Uber out here, and then I couldn't get an Uber back. So I had to call someone to come pick me up. Actually, I had to call police to come pick me up.
I didn't know there were any Ubers available up here.
Well, usually there aren't, but I'm Canadian, so I had no idea. So when I saw it pop up, I'm like, sure, I'll take an Uber. That sounds fine. And then I got lost and stuck in Walmart.
Yeah, there's been like none in Altoona since COVID. Like
There was
before
one,
there'd
his
be
name
like
was Ronald,
4,
and he was
maybe
very
5.
funny. Huh?
Before there'd be like 4 or 5 down there, like a
Yeah.
night, but now it's like 0.
No, he's like, you're so lucky. I was on my way home from work, and I was like trying to like go that way anyways, and so he came and picked like me and my roommate up and took us there, and then she was so mad at me. She's like, you got stuck here. What kind of idea is this?
Is there a bus that comes here?
There's like
I know there's buses like in like Evansburg, but I don't know where they go.
There's like a transportation system that like they run through my practices on Fridays.
Oh.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So you were stuck calling someone.
Yeah.
My uncle is like this huge, burly man, and he used to be a guard for the prison, and now he's an Uber driver.
So he's got fun stories
He goes
for the
to
rides.
state college, yeah. He goes to state college and drives all the college kids around, and he's so serious and like huge. It's just funny, like he's really intimidating.
You know where I was going with this now. Where was I?
Sorry.
Okay, so yeah, so taxi medallions, they restrict the supply. So there's only so many people that can drive taxis. And this really made sense 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even 20 years ago, where people didn't have little maps in their pockets that literally tell them where to go and the fastest way to do it. So you needed to restrict it to people that knew what the hell they were doing and where they were going, or else people are going to get lost, and it'll be a mess. But now that's not really the case because obviously it's a lot easier to get around, and there's a lot more people that want to use taxis. In New York City, a couple years ago, probably 10 years ago, because the text said a couple years ago, taxi medallions cost $1 million to buy. Insane amount of money because of how much demand there were for taxi drivers. So what this restriction ends up doing is reducing the consumer surplus and producer surplus. We end up with this dead weight loss from all these transactions that could occur but don't occur because of this artificial restriction. So then Uber comes in and just completely ignores the taxi medallion regulations. Offers users cheap rides, super convenient to come pick you up no matter where you are. You can order when you're inside, you don't have to stand on the street and wave down a taxi. And operators benefit from being able to operate this service without the super expensive medallions that are like impossible to buy personally. You have to go to the taxi company and work for them to do it. Uber has a great technology, just the app that links buyers and sellers together. And I mean, I could go on for a while about how prices are constantly adjusting to equilibrium depending on how many drivers are out there and how many people are seeking rides, which is really cool. It's like an economist's dream. But one of the textbook, when this edition was written, Uber's market value is estimated about $50 billion. So this can give you a sense of the size of the deadweight loss across the whole country for the shortage of taxi drivers from this artificial restriction. So kind of like how Airbnb is a way that landlords can get around rent control, decrease that deadweight loss that's caused by the reduction in apartments. In the same way, Uber has been able to reduce the deadweight loss from the restrictions that prevent more taxi drivers from being able to enter the market. All right, so that brings us to the end of this section. Do you guys have any questions about government's, I don't know, policies that move us out of equilibrium? So like price floors, price ceilings, prohibition, all that's good stuff? Okay. So in this class, we talked about trade-offs, like the production possibility frontiers. Any of you guys have a good example from like pop culture about like trade-offs people had to face? Giving up something to get something else?
Like, successful or like a failure?
Successful or unsuccessful? From like a movie or TV show or song or news?
JoJo's Siwa to become like as well off as she was, and like she had to kind of like change her personality to fit the certain character that they were looking for. Like she is over the top bubbly, but she basically isn't allowed to swear. She has to dress a certain way and all that stuff. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that. What's her name?
JoJo's Siwa.
She's 16 and she looks like she's like 8.
Yeah, she wears bows in her hair, but it's all because she's trying to reach the market of like 4 to 12-year-olds. That's a bit of a stretch, but Justice and Walmart were two of her biggest supporters in the kids section. And so to become that kind of icon and to be able to continue her music career, she had to do that through like being a PG and many others.
Giving up her hairline.
Yeah.
Oh my
Yeah, that's
god. It's becoming half freaking bald.
Back in like the N64 days when I was like doing console and like when ET was coming out in popular, I don't remember what company it was, but they tried making the ET game and they're like, oh yeah, people will love this, and they made so many.
Oh, that's the one that was garbage.
I'm pretty sure it was ET, but
No, like the game was garbage.
I don't remember that much, but I just know that they made a bunch. It failed horribly, and they were just massive, like they dumped literally millions of the N64 budget.
Yeah, they made like more than there were like consoles that people had for some reason.
Yeah.
Talk about entrepreneurial error. So I need this for a blog post, and I'm trying to tie in, make at least like a passing reference to something pop culture that like people can get. I'm talking about trade-offs.
Oh, there's also kind of following along the musician line. This happens a lot, but with K-pop artists, they're basically owned by their producers. So everything they do, everything they wear, everything they get a tattoo of,
Completely controlled.
it has to go through their producers first. So they give up their freedom.
They have like Kesha.
Kesha, yeah.
Yeah, how
She's one of
Kesha
the-
had to give up like, herself for her producer to see the music. That would be a good one. Well, not good.
Yeah, not good, but
Not good. Not good. Good example. Not good for her.
Have you seen the thing with Britney Spears? Everybody's like, is Britney okay?
Oh my god, yeah, or what's his name? Guy who's on one of those.
Oh, Howie Mandel.
Yeah, Howie
Yeah.
Mandel. I'm like, what's his name?
Oh, yeah.
What's wrong with that one?
yeah, what's going on with Howie?
Like, yeah. And then they were doing like wear a blue shirt with writing on it if you are, and then you wear a blue shirt with writing so they
Yeah,
couldn't
Brittany
find-
would wear it like the one person who would wear yellow if you need help, and she wore yellow the next video and was like,
And then we're like have flowers in your next post if you really need help, and then she posted 3 things with flowers. So like everyone was panicking that Howie Mandel and Britney Spears were like being kidnapped or something.
That's a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
And then David Dobrik went and checked on Howie Mandel and he was fine.
So did he was he oblivious to that and he happened to post things and like do things, or was he feeding into like the?
Either he was trying to do it, like he was playing, he didn't say that he was like doing it to like play with people. I think he was reading the comments and he's like, hey, I could make money off of this. Because the more views you get on TikTok, the more money you make. So I think that's how that happened. I don't know about Brittany though, she's just happy.
Hey, leave Brittany alone. Wow, that laugh was really reassuring. As soon as I said that, I'm like, they might not remember that.
That's a good reference.
That's a throwback. Okay. Well, thanks for your guys' help on that. If I ever hit snags with pop culture stuff or references or stuff like blog posts I write, I'd turn to my class and ask them questions. It's easier than just me sitting and thinking to myself. Okay. So let's move on to the economic effect of taxes. So we're going to look at taxes, like per unit taxes that government places on the sale of goods or services. To keep the analysis very simple, we'll be using per unit taxes instead of like percentage taxes. So an example of this is the federal government imposes 18.4 cent tax per gallon of gasoline in 2015. So we'll see how that affects the market. Because taxes, we'll see how they distort economic decisions by altering the incentives that individuals face. So here's the market for cigarettes. So the original equilibrium here is where the first supply curve crosses the demand curve, so point A. Price is $5, and the quantity of cigarettes is 4 billion. My hands are too shaky to hit those numbers too close to each other. So let's say we put a $1 tax per pack of cigarettes on like the sale of cigarettes. What this is going to do, it shifts up the supply curve by $1. Because we're now putting an increased cost on it. So what this does, at the new equilibrium, where the new supply curve crosses the demand curve, the price is going to be $5.90, and the quantity of cigarettes sold is going to fall to 3.7 billion packs per year. So we have a large increase in price compared to a relatively small decrease in the quantity that's being purchased. So firms are going to sell 4 billion packs at the price of $5 before the tax. The price they get needs to be exactly $1 higher if they're going to continue to sell 4 billion packs. Because in this case, their marginal cost is increased by $1 per unit. Well, it turns out they're not going to be able to get increase the price by $1. That's only going to increase by 90 cents. So they're not going to sell as many. So that's why the quantity sold on the market decreases to 3.7 billion. So while this new equilibrium price is at point B, where the new supply curve crosses the demand curve, the consumers are going to pay $5.90 for this pack of cigarettes with the tax on it. And producers are going to receive that price, that $5.90 per pack at point B. But now they have to turn and pay that dollar tax to the government. So when they pay that tax to the government, pay that dollar, they're left with $4.90. So point C on the old supply curve. Where that is, that's at, this point C is the 3.7 billion packs they're selling, so at that quantity, which is the new equilibrium quantity. You kind of trace that down to the old supply curve. So what happens for the government? Remember, they're putting a tax on this, so they're trying to get tax revenue from this. It's going to be equal to this box right here. So the price the consumers pay versus what the producers receive after paying the tax. So that, in this case, is $1, it's a $1 tax, times the number of units, in this case 3.7 billion. That whole, it's supposed to be green, which is kind of like a grayish brown here. This whole rectangle is going to be tax revenue for the government. And there's going to be a small area of deadweight loss. The two, they're supposed to be yellow triangles. That because those 0.3 billion packs of cigarettes aren't sold, those transactions don't take place, we have this small deadweight loss. Yeah, So basically what happens, in this case, consumers have to pay 90 cents more per pack of cigarettes. So their costs, they face the burden of 90% of the tax, and producers end up paying 10% of the tax. So they get 10% of the burden of this new tax that's placed on them. So both consumers and producers are made worse off in this situation. Well, just in looking at this market, they're made worse off. They may be made better off because taxes, are used to provide services. So they do get some benefit from this. But just purely thinking about this market, they both end up being made worse off. Another example is gasoline. Oh, sorry, wait. Yeah, so we'll look at gasoline. If there's no tax on gasoline in this market, equilibrium price is $2.50. There's 144 billion gallons sold per year. That's the initial equilibrium price. Then we put a 10-cent per gallon excise tax on that. So for every gallon gas you buy, you have to pay extra 10 cents. So we're going to increase the supply curve, S1 to S2. That's going to go up. Right there, the difference is 10 cents. So the new equilibrium price, the price that consumers are going to be paying, in this case is $2.58. So it goes up by 8 cents, where the new supply curve, S2, crosses the demand curve. Now the price the sellers receive is going to be 10 cents less than that. So it's going to be $2.40. And that's going to be this new equilibrium quantity, the 140 billion gallons of gas sold at that quantity where it crosses the original supply curve. So in this case, consumers are going to pay 8 cents of this tax, and sellers are going to pay 2 cents of the tax. So again, both buyers and sellers are paying take some of the burden of the tax. They're going to pay some of it to the government. So who ends up bearing the burden of the tax is called the tax incidence. So the actual division of burden of a tax between buyers and sellers in the market. Who pays how much? It's getting late in class, so I'm not going to show this video. There's like a 10-minute video for Marginal Revolution. These slides are on Canvas, so you can click on it on Canvas, and it gives, basically goes through this again. So if you need more studying for this or something, it's there for you. So what determines the tax incidence is not whoever has to legally write the check and give it to the government. It's determined by the interaction of supply and demand. So let's look at the same example for gas, only instead of sellers, so the gas stations having to write the check to the government, in this case it's the buyers that are having to write the check to the government. So buyers have a legal obligation to pay the 10-cent tax on gasoline. So the price they pay, you're going to shift the demand curve instead of the supply curve because it's now the consumer is paying for it. So we still have that 10-cent difference between the original demand curve and the new demand curve. So where this new demand curve, D2, crosses the supply curve, it is going to be the equilibrium price and quantity. So $2.48 is the price that sellers receive. And then the price that consumers have to pay, which includes the tax, is going to be $2.58. So at that quantity on the original demand curve. So how does this compare to the previous slide? We have $2.58 being paid by consumers and $2.48 being what sellers take home. We see the same thing here. So no matter who has to pay the tax, who's to physically write that check, both sides are going to end up facing the same tax incidence, no matter how we design who pays. So it's no relation to who actually pays the tax. Now, what determines the tax incidence is going to be determined by the relative slopes of supply and demand curves. So if you have a very steep demand curve, like in this case, we have a very steep demand curve, relatively less steep supply curve. In that case, that means buyers aren't going to change how much they buy by very much when the price changes. They're pretty insensitive to price changes. So that means they're going to take much of the burden of the tax. On the other hand, if there's a shallow demand curve, buyers are going to change how much they buy a lot when price changes. So if the demand curve is more shallow than the supply curve, then they're not going to face much of the burden of the tax. It'll be the producers who face more of the burden of the tax. And we can flip that for sellers. So basically, whoever has a steeper demand curve, whoever is less sensitive to a change in price, is going to end up paying more of the tax. In this case, we have buyers who are less sensitive to a change in price. So they end up paying more of it. But if we flip that, if we drew a supply curve where again, we have suppliers. Here we have a regular demand curve, but suppliers are not sensitive to price at all. So again, buyers are going to bear more of the burden of the tax. So we have this regular demand curve. Very steep supply curve, where they're not, in this case, sellers are relatively less sensitive to a price change. So when price increases, they're not going to increase how much they sell by very much. If the price decreases, they're not going to decrease by how much they sell by very much. In this case, they bear most of the burden of the tax.
Who is it? The bears? The burden?
The sellers. So a basic rule to remember is that whoever is less sensitive to a change in price is the one that's going to be paying more of the tax. All right, we have just a couple minutes left and we have one slide left, so this is going perfect. So we look at Social Security taxes. The federal insurance, the FICA tax, is 15% of wages, and it funds Social Security and Medicare. Half of it employers pay, half of it employees pay. And by pay, I mean they have the legal obligation to send that money in. But who actually has the burden of the tax? That's going to depend on who's less sensitive to changes in wages. Whether that's employers, they're going to be the demand side, the consumer of labor, or workers. They're going to be, like, in this case, the seller of labor. Workers are relatively insensitive to their wages, meaning that they don't really change their hours worked based on how their wages change. So workers end up with most of the burden of this tax. And yeah, this is the last slide. Let's say, for simplicity's sake, we put $1 per hour Social Security tax on workers. In this case, employers are paying. Employers pay $10.05, employees get $9.05. So 5 cents are paid by employers, 95 cents by employees. If we look at workers paying the tax, they're actually writing the check. Same exact numbers, the same result. 95% of that is paid by employees, 5% is being paid by employers. Again, because they're less sensitive to a change in price than firms are. So no matter who legally has the requirement to pay the tax, the burden is felt by who is less sensitive to price. Obviously, governments prefer to put it on businesses because then people don't feel as if they're being taxed as much. They don't notice it because they're not physically the ones paying it. But at the end of the day, it's as if they're being taxed. Same. You guys have any questions?